Masechta Bava basra daf tzadik vav amud aleph starting with tzadik hey amud beis, 5 lines in the bottom. Amud Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda had said, Yain manim kabechanis, wine that's sold in the store. Usually at that time it's already about to turn into vinegar. You make the bracha peri pri hagafim because the smell is vinegar, the taste is a taste of wine. And as long as the taste of wine, Rabbi Yehuda says you make a peri pri hagafim. Chizda amar legabe chamra de akrim. When they get a soured wine, lamali, why should he make a bracha peri pri hagafim? Rather, the bracha is shakol ne'ir v'dvarim. Meisvei, here's the kasha from a brayse on Rabbi Yehuda who says that you make a peri pri hagafim. Alapa sheipsho, bread that became moldy, v'alayan sheikim, and wine that became sour, v'altav shafra tzurasei, and a cook that became spoiled. Oima shakol ne'ir v'dvarim. That everything became because of Hashem's word. So from the Braisa, you see a statement that the bracha on yaim shehikra, on soured wine, the bracha is shakol ne'ir v'dvarim. And with the Gemara Rabbi Avzid, Meir Rabbi Yehuda beputzima, the mizdab makanosa, by a case of wine that a case of wine that's sold only in the corners of the city, where the people are going and passing by, coming from different places. So they don't have time, and they're not medactic in what kind of wine they're getting. They drink whatever comes to the hand. So those type of wine, which is very inferior wine, there you don't make the bracha of Beire Pri Hagafim. Amalei Abai Rabbi Yisrael, Abai said to Rabbi Yisrael, oh, Rabbi Yehuda, we have the Shita Rabbi Yehuda, that wine that sours, as long as it tastes like wine, has a din like wine. Oh, Rav Chizdam, we have the din of Rav Chizdam, that if as long as it smells like vinegar, it's not wine. Mark Mansirulei, who Rabbi Yisrael, who do you hold like? Amalei Rabbi Yisrael, the Abai Masnisi Yadain. I have a brayse that I know from which we could be pushed the shaila, but first we're going to learn the brayse. We're not going to be able to be mevaya yet. Only after we go through the brayse, then we will go back to Rav Yosef. The time that we learned the brayse, is one who would check from time to time the chavis of yayin to know if the wine turned into chemetz. He had many barrels of wine, which were tevel. And whenever he would take a barrel of wine of tevel or drink it or sell it, he designated one barrel instead of taking every time a little bit from each barrel off. He's designated one barrel for many barrels, of which from that barrel he would take off for each barrel that he would sell. The barrel of tevel that he would sell, he would take off from one barrel that he designated to take off for Trumas Umaisis. So that barrel that he normally would take off of Truma Umaisis, he would check it from time to time to make sure it didn't become a chemetzik. Of course, it's been a geya to if it did turn chemetzik. There's a machlekes of Tanoim. But been a geya taking off from chemetz halayayin, and according to Chachamim, it's taka one min. But according to Rabbi says no, it's considered as the two separate minin, and therefore you would not be yaitze by taking off from chemetz for yayin. So therefore he would check. The Allah is like Rabbi, and we would check if this barrel, which he would take off Tumas Umaisis from, whether it was wine or vinegar. And then afterwards, he checked, and then afterwards, he checked and he found that it was vinegar. So now it's a suffix if all those barrels, that from the time of checking and after, was it considered as vinegar, and he was not yetzer with the afrashas tumah maises, or not? Says the Mishnah, says the Baraisa, right? Kol shlesh yamim, all the 3 days, the din of Chavis has a din as a vadai, and we'll soon explain what it means. And from here and forth, Suffolk has a din like Suffolk. What does it mean that these 3 days is a vadai, and from here on it's going to be considered as a safka. This is how you have to learn the pshat and v'raisa kol shlish yom ha'rishonim. All for the first 3 days, right after the bedika, the first 3 days, vada has a thing like yayin, avada yayin, and all of the barrels that were of tevel that was separated, all the barrels that were sold from after the bedika, the first 3 days after the bedika, is a good hafrasha. And it's ois, and those barrels that he sold is not considered as tevel. But after the 3 days after the bedika, There, it's going to have a suffix. It's going to be a suffix if the wines that he sold that were tavel that he took off from this specific barrel, that later on we found out it was chametz, we're not sure after the 3 days if had it in like vinegar or not. In fact, one of my time, what is the reason that the first 3 days is abade, that it's considered right after the bedika? Any barrels that he sold, any barrels of tavel that he sold, and he took off mices from this specific barrel that the last bedika he checked was chametz, we're going to say the first 3 days is a vadai, considered as a yayin, and it was a good hafrasha. So he says, because chamra me'iloi yakar, because wine, where does it start to be change its taste? From the top of the barrel, and it goes from the top little by little till the bottom. That's where it turns into vinegar. Hi, Timur, and this one who checked it the first time, it was completely wine and it didn't smell vinegarish. And even if you're going to say that immediately after he tasted it, it turned chametzik, the smell, the odor, the aroma was vinegar, and the taste was wine. And the aroma that's vinegar and the taste is wine, then it has a din like wine. So even if it takes 3 days that the taste should turn into vinegar, and therefore those first 3 days, let's say it turned into vinegar, but the taste was still wine, it still has a din like wine. And therefore, whatever he took off from the tavel barrels, from this, whatever he took off from this barrel that turned into vinegar, but the first 3 days after he checked, it will have a din like wine, and it will be a good truma umaisis, and it will be oistavel. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Amar, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi explains the Raisa Koshlish Yom Achroinim. What's the vade going on? It's going on the last 3 days before the bedika, the last bedika. Vadai, for sure, the wine. When he checked the last time, it was chametz. So he means the last 3 days before he tasted the wine that it was chametz. For sure, it was chametz. Mekan lahalan, and anything prior to those 3 days is. Before the last bedika, there was 3 days before the last bedika. Those 3 days before the last bedika is for sure vinegar, and any wine that he sold from the table and took off from this barrel that he tasted, the last taste was chametz. Even up the 3 days before that is avada going to be considered as vinegar, and he wouldn't have been considered as trumas sumaisis for those barrels that were table, and he would have to take off again. Now, where's the suffix? Prior to those 3 days is a suffix if the barrel was considered as wine or vinegar. In fact, by time, what's the reason for Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi? Because because where does the wine start becoming vinegar, turn into vinegar from the bottom? So and say that when he tasted it, he didn't even know that the bottom was turning into vinegar. And even if you're going to find to say that it starts turning vinegar from the top, but he tasted it and it wasn't a taste of vinegar. Says but maybe right after he tasted it, it started to turn vinegar. You have the smell of vinegar and the taste is wine. So from that moment, he holds that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi holds even if just the aroma it smells like vinegar, and the taste is wine. Chala, according to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, any aroma that smells chametzik, vinegar, smells vinegar, and the taste is wine, has a din like chametz. That's why it's not going to have a din. And therefore, it's not going to be considered as trumas umaisis for those barrels that were tavel that he sold, and he would have to take off again trumas umaisis. A third year, the Remoy Mas Nishma, the Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, the Chachmei from the south, the Chacham from the south, learned the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi that the Shainim, after the first bedika, the first 3 days after the first bedika, vada yain, this for sure has a din like wine. So in those first 3 days, if he took off If he sold any barrels of tevel and took off from mice or tumas from that barrel, within the 3 days of the first B'dikis, for sure, consider it as good wine, and it's a good Maisa Truma Achreinim. But the last 3 days before the last B'dika, Vadechlemitz has a din for sure as vinegar. And so Iyim, and those days in between, after the first 3 days of the first B'dika, and the 3 days before the last B'dika, all those days in between, it's a suffix. If I had a din like Tumas or not, and therefore all those barrels that he sold in those Tzayim Dikadei, those middle days, is a suffix if it's still tevel, and he would have to take off again Tumas in this third beer, we have a stira in the words of the third beer. Barti, you said Rishonim in the first 3 days after the B'dika, it's a Vade Yain, has a din for sure as wine. So you see that even though if the smell was vinegar and the taste was wine, it's wine. Because if it was considered as vinegar, then we should have been concerned. Maybe immediately after he was waiting, the smell became chaymetz, and now it's a suffix if it has a din of wine or not. And then afterwards you said by the last B'dika, the 3 last days before the last B'dika, Achreinim, the last days, Vadei Chlemitz, he said has a short din of vinegar. You see, if the aroma was vinegar with tamar chamra and the smell, the taste was wine, challah has a din like vinegar. Because if it had a din like wine, then the chavis should have had a din like a suffix in those 3 days right before the last B'dika. Because it could be only at the time of the B'dika, that's when it turned into vinegar. Now we're going to go back to the original Shaila. Kaman Pashidli. Like, who did Rav Yosef Paskin been again to the bracha? Because did he Paskin that it has, when the taste tastes like wine, even though the aroma is vinegar, has a din like wine, and therefore the bracha should be by the priyagafim? Or he Paskin like Rabbi Shuban Levi, that wine that was that smells like vinegar, even though it tastes like wine, the bracha is shakol near with worry. So like who? So you might have put your bird. Amari with Absid. One says like Rabbi Yochanan that the ik is the taste, and if it tastes like wine, the bracha is by the priyagaf. Chad Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, and one said that Rabbi Yosef followed the shita of Yeshua ben Levi, even if just the aromas is vinegar, you still make a bracha of shakal with water, even though it tastes like wine. One who sells a barrel of wine to his friend, and it turned into vinegar. The first 3 days, right after the sale, if it became chaymetzik, the meicha is responsible, because the first 3 days, right after of the sale, even though the aroma is vinegar, but the taste is wine, and so the din is that you make a very priyagafen and has a din that you can take off tumas maisis. But when it came to a sale, he wanted to buy quality wine, and here it turned out it wasn't quality wine, because within the 3 days it became already vinegar. It must have been that within the 3 days, so it was in the Shus HaMeicha that it started to turn into vinegar. So therefore the Mekach is bottled, the Kava Eilich. But if it turned into vinegar after the 3 days, it's just like then it's on the head of the Lekeach, and therefore the sale is a good sale. So you want to Shmuel says, Chamra, Kas, the Mari Shavar, the Mech is not Chayiv, because the wine, once it went into Lekeach, it could be the wine that he sold was quality wine. And it turned into vinegar much faster than the normal, faster than 3 days, because of his sin, like the Gemara will say later on. The Gemara says that it's Mazal Shabailov. The Chet causes Lechimus Hayayin. The Chet causes that there should be, the Ashbam says, it causes that the wine should turn into vinegar faster. That the Ashbam says, Av, Shav, Der Klal, Chimus Hayayin, Shosha Yom. Even though B'derech Klal it takes 3 days, but here it was possible that it was much faster because he sinned. Rav Yosef paskin like Rabbi Shicha when it came to beer, that if it was within 3 days that it's spoiled, and it has it's the same amount of days, just like wine. It takes 3 days to spoil. So if it's within the 3 days, he said the mekach is bottle. But when it came to wine, he passed like Shmuel that even if it's within the 3 days, the mecha is a good mecha, and the only reason why it's spoiled because of the mazel of the lekeach, he sinned. The halacha is like Shmuel, that by wine, the mecha is going to be a good mecha. Wine made from dates. I'm sorry, beer made from dates. Beer made from barley. And the one who made a drink out of the shmar yayin by pouring water over the lees, and it tasted like wine. On all three, you make the bracha shakol nemitvari. Shmarim, which is a cheshva drink because it has the taste of wine. Rabbi Yosef say, they both say, Allah is not like the Achirim, that rather you make the bracha of Sha'akil Niyu B'dvari. Zog the Gemara, the Kul Yam, everybody agrees. If he poured over these leaves of the Shmarim, leaves and in the taste of wine, there were 3 cases of water over the Shmarim, and when he took out he poured 3 cases over these shmarim, he got 4 cases. Then you could say it's wine, because wine has to be diluted 1 to 4. A quarter has to be, 3/4 has to be diluted in order to be able to drink. Because in those days, in the Zman HaGemara, the yayin was so strong, and they wouldn't drink it raw. Rather, they would mix it with water. So Rava says that. That if it was 1/4 was wine, then it's good. Any wine that's unable to have 3 chalakim of water and 1 chalik of wine, then it's mamish considered as water. When you pour over the shmarim and you can't get a 1 cup of wine besides the 3 cups of water, then it's not considered as wine. If he poured 3 cups of water and only 3 cups of water came out, so none of it was really wine. It's the same water that went in and came out. Keep with they argue that where they poured 3 cups of water and 3.5 came out, so half of it is for sure wine. Rabbanim nothing. The Rabbanim say, hey, 3/4 of water was put in, and the same 3 cases came out, so it's not really, it's all water. Pashli Palga, if in the Taruvis there was a half a case of wine that came out from the Shmarim, besides the 3 cups of water, Palga Beshisa, Palga Maya, Velaikumo. So if you have a half a cup of wine versus 3 cups of water, so that's 1/6 for sure. It's not going to be considered as anything, and you can only make a shakal. It's not a dinner of wine. The others hold no, Klasa all train Palga nothing. He says Yitaka poured 3/4 of water. Of the 3 cups of water, only 2.5 of the water came out, and the other cup was all wine. Pashle kuza. So you have a 1 full cup of wine, tasting wine. Because of palga, now you have a much stronger wine. It's not a 1 to 4. Here you're talking about a 1 cup to 2.5. Such 2.5 cases of water versus 1 cup. Chamamayu is a chesh of wine, and certainly you're going to make the bracha of Beire Pri Hagafen.